I'm honored to be back here at Fall Focus to be presenting some of my work. I wore a lot of hats when I was at Simmental, and then I took an extension position at Iowa State, and now I'm wearing even more hats than I even thought was possible. So I am a trained geneticist, but today I'm going to have a talk that has really very little to do with genetics. So, and I'm really glad that Dr. Martinez is going after me because I'm pretty sure the room would have been empty otherwise. So, but I'm going to talk about a project. So at Iowa State, we have a lot of nutritionists, and I'm the only beef faculty who is not a nutritionist. So I get to do about every other project that pertains to cow-calf possible. And this was one of the projects. So we wanted to look at some factors that affect heifer development and pregnancy, and hopefully I'm hoping that long-term for research that this could be developed into some strategies for selecting heifers for improving fertility and reproduction in herds. So when we talk about heifers and heifer development, there's a huge economic aspect to it. Okay, so the reproductive success of a heifer leads to improvement in reproductive efficiency for your entire cow herd. Okay, a heifer is going to be what we call a non-producer for 2 years until she's 2 years of age. That means that by the time you get a calf out of that heifer to recoup your initial investment, she's 2 years of age. Now, heifers do fit in this kind of unique situation, especially right now in the current cattle market. Okay, so if we have a heifer going from weaning to yearling, if we don't get her pregnant, if we can identify that early on, guess where she can go? Into the feedlot, and we can still recoup some of that expense on her. So it's the one time that we're going to still see that appreciation from yearling to 2-year-old. Once she gets past that point, as she ages, we start to see a little bit of appreciation on her as a female, but as long as she's producing a calf, we can recoup that initial investment over time. But a failure of a heifer to calve as a 2-year-old, that equates to a fairly large economic loss for operations. Now, the key for heifer pregnancy and success for that heifer is puberty. We need to set these heifers up so that they can be cycling by the time we get to breeding season. And this is controlled by genetics, our environment, and the nutrition. Okay, early cycling heifers we've seen for lifetime productivity, they're more likely to stay in the herd long term. Okay, if she's cycling early in that breeding season, she's more likely to get bred early in that breeding season. She's going to calve a heavier calf, and she's got a longer recovery time so that she can breed back that next year. So research has just shown that these heifers that breed early in the breeding season, they tend to stay in the herd longer. And understanding those influences that affect puberty can ultimately affect that heifer pregnancy rate. Okay, like I said, I am not a nutritionist, I'm a geneticist. So by nature, we tend to be a little bit competitive with the nutritionists, and I hate to give them credit, but they get some credit here, right? We need to provide nutrition to our cow herd. We heard that earlier this morning with Allison's talks. We need to provide that nutrition. Strong correlation between body weight and puberty. Okay? And a lot of the research and a lot of the recommendations come from that. And we say a lot for management is we use these kind of targeted body weights and body condition scores for setting our heifers up for success when they go into the breeding season. And we really want to match that development program to the genotype, to the type of cattle that you have and your production system. Okay, and common heifer development programs, it's usually going to be dry lot, winter grazing, and maybe putting them on in corn residues. And as I came to the Midwest, I started to see a lot more heifers being developed in dry lots. Okay, I had a little bit of a hard time with it. I was like, why aren't they out on pastures and cheap resources? Well, in the Midwest, one of the biggest resource constraints is actually land availability, right? Especially in Iowa, when you're competing against row crops, there's a lot of restriction on the available land. So typically a lot of management systems are going to be dry lotting those heifers to make sure that they're developed. Feed is a cheap resource in the Midwest, so we tend to see a lot more heifers in dry lots being developed. So in Iowa, we're getting geared up for our, what I call extension season on steroids. So as soon as harvest is in, we kick off in a bunch of extension programming. Some of that is about heifer development. We talk about these recommendations quite frequently. So when we're talking about getting our heifers into our breeding, we would like to see them at about 60 to 65% of their mature weight. So if your mature cow size is on average about 1,300 pounds, which is frankly a little bit on the low side for what we're seeing average here in the Midwest, you're going to see those heifers be about 780 to 850 pounds, and that's that target weight you want to get them at going into breeding. It's going to be bigger if your mature cow size, if the average of your cow herd is higher than that, you're going to have to get those heifers to a heavier weight. Okay, but that's kind of our ideal, our gold standard. We use body condition scores, so if she's in a 5 or 6, you're probably sitting in pretty good shape going into that breeding season. Now, there's other research that has come out that has kind of challenged this recommendation that we have of the 65% of body weight. Okay, so work in Nebraska looked at if you took your heifers, you raised them in a dry lot, and got them to about that 65% of their mature body weight at time of breeding, compared to what happens if we put them out on winter grazing. They came in being a little bit lighter. They were about 50, 55% of their mature weight. How did that affect their ability to get pregnant? And then in this research, what they found is there was really no difference ultimately in pregnancy rates between the two groups. And they made the argument that if you put them out on winter grazing, developed them to a smaller percentage of their mature body weight, which you could save some money in the long term. Now here they said net cost of one pregnant heifer was $985 for the dry lot group and $940 for that extensive group. Keep in mind that paper was published in 2011. I'm pretty sure those prices would be quite a bit higher in today's market. Okay, but the take-home message is that we're going to see these heifers that are a smaller percentage of their mature weight. They're a little less expensive to develop to that point. So based off of this research, I had submitted a grant to the Iowa Checkoff, of which they funded it. It funded a grad student of mine, Sarah Phelps, who just defended this work last month and has moved on. And what we wanted to look at is said, okay, if we have these two strategies, what's the characterization of these heifers? How are these two different groups of heifers developing? What are they looking at as far as fat and muscle deposition? And are there any other things that could be potentially contribute to the success of these heifers as we developed on these two different strategies? So in order to answer these questions, we used the ISU McNay research herd. So this is a research herd down in southern Iowa, not very far from Missouri state line actually. It was started in '96. And this was a herd that really utilized the use of ultrasound technology to make genetic improvement for carcass traits. And they were selected heavily for intramuscular fat and marbling. And no, that is not a typo when I talk about the carcass data. Over the last 10 years, we finish out with at least 30 to 60% of our calves are going prime pretty consistently. Okay, that's pretty crazy numbers, right? So this is my poster child for talking about when genetics, when we use it, it actually does work, okay? So this is our poster child. Great for looking at use of improving marbling. But my question was, could this potentially be hindering or helping with reproduction for heifers getting pregnant? So heifers that are that have a lot of IMF, could it be affecting their ability to get pregnant? Okay, and this is important because what are we going for an industry for selection? How much pressure are we putting in marbling? A lot. Angus's genetic trend for marbling has had a close to 200% increase in marbling EPD in the last 10 to 15 years. Okay, so could this be affecting our ability to get these heifers pregnant? So for this study, we used 124 Angus heifers. We divided them into two groups. So we had our non-restricted group. This was a group that was developed to our target of 65% of mature weight. We also had a restricted group that we developed to a smaller percentage of that mature body weight to our target of 55. So basically, we were looking at developing them at a different average daily gain. And we collected, for about every 60 days, we took a carcass ultrasound of these heifers. And Patrick Wall, who's one of our field specialists and certified ultrasound technician, he had a few choice words for me when I asked him to ultrasound these heifers a week after weaning. He was not too happy about that. But we did it anyway. Every 60 days we measured them. We took a body weight, body condition score, ultrasound carcass measurements. We took a reproductive tract score on them before breeding, and then ultimately we collected breeding percentages. And this is just a diagram kind of showing every 60 days how we collected that, plus or minus a day or two due to scheduling. We did synchronize them to use AI. We used a 7-day cedar protocol, and then 10 days later we turned out a bull for a 45-day breeding season. Okay, and that time, the other thing too that I want to point out is when we AI'd, that group that was on the higher average daily gain, our non-restricted group, they were our classic dry lot management. We turned them out on grass at that point in time. The other group had been out on grass previously. They were always intended to be kind of a winter grazing group, but at that time we had grass turnout. So why use carcass ultrasound? Okay. When it comes down to it, you know, we can get a better, more definite idea of the body composition of these heifers as they're developing. We can see how much back fat they're putting on, how much muscle are they putting on, and how much are they putting in for marbling. The other thing is that it is a more reliable tool than using body condition score. Okay, I am from New Mexico, so I will tell you my body condition scores are always one higher than everybody else. Okay, heifer comes in and I'm like, oh, she looks pretty good. I'm gonna give her a 5. And all of my Iowa colleagues are like, oh, she's definitely a 4. She's a little skinny. Okay, so we always have this little difference in opinion, but I'm consistent about it. Okay, but there's a little bit of subjectivity to body condition scoring. And I wanted to remove that and look and see how are these heifers developing and what's changing between these two groups. Okay, so these are our ultrasound measurements and weight measurements from a week at post-weaning all the way up to when we AI'd. Blue line is going to represent our non-restricted group. This is our dry lot group that had a higher average daily gain. The red is going to be our restricted group. And I don't think there's any big shock. We see differences. Okay, so the restricted group, they were lighter at time of weaning. They had smaller ribeye, less back fat, less rump fat, and also less intramuscular fat, less IMF. What is interesting is we didn't see that deviation in IMF until quite a bit later during their development when we started to see that deviation. Another thing too was our reprotract scores and our pelvic measurements. So no real difference in reprotract scores, but we did see a big difference in pelvic areas between the two groups. So that restricted group had on average smaller pelvic areas, and we actually ended up culling more out of that restricted group because they just fell below farm minimums for breeding. So we made the decision to go ahead and cull them at that point in time. We also had a handful from the non-restricted group that just didn't meet our minimal requirements for the farm. They were also culled as well. Looking at the response to our synchronized protocol, 100% of those who were in the non-restricted group, the higher average daily gain group, they all responded to the sync protocol. Okay, that's compared to our restricted group that 25% of them just didn't even respond, had no indication of cycling at that point when we went up to AI them. So as a result, we had a lower AI conception on that restricted group. When we look at our overall pregnancy, we had a higher percentage get pregnant via AI, but it wasn't a statistical difference. We see a numerical difference, but it's not statistically different. But I'm going to throw in the caveat, I had a fairly small sample size for looking at these differences for pregnancy rates. Okay, so we see this difference. Is it real or not? It's something that we're going to explore further down the road. But ultimately, our total pregnancy rates were about the same between both groups. Now, this is great, but this isn't really incorporating all those carcass measures that we just took, you know, and I had people cussing at me taking all these measurements every 60 days, right? So how does this play in? So we actually conducted what's called a logistic regression. Okay, this is a regression because pregnancy is either a 0 or a 1, right? She's either open or she's pregnant. Okay, it's not like weight where we have a continuous trait where we have, you know, 1, 2, 3 pound measures. This is a 0 or a 1 scenario. So as a result, we'd use what's called a logistic regression. And we took all of our variables and we put it in the model. Okay, and we did some model selection, and the final model that fit the best included group, which is going to be our restricted versus non-restricted, back fat, and IMF. Now this was the best fitting model, but really at the end of the day, IMF was not found to be significant. So what I take away from this is it tells us that ribeye and IMF aren't really significant predictors or don't have a strong association to heifer pregnancy, but back fat and how we develop them does. Okay, so here's our results. The odds of pregnancy was 5 times greater in the restricted versus the non-restricted group. Okay, I'm going to say this again. 5 times greater for our restricted group versus our non-restricted group. Now, how many of you guys out there are sitting there going, bullshit? How the hell is our restricted group having a higher odds of getting pregnant than our non-restricted group? Okay, show of hands, who thinks that's pretty bogus, right? And my poor grad student must have gone through it and cleaned this data and rerun this about 100 times. The caveat, though, is that the way we're interpreting this data is that we're holding back fat constant in this interpretation. So when we consider back fat, suddenly this makes sense. So what you want to think about is if we think about 2 heifers, one in the restricted group, one in the non-restricted group, if they are at the same level of back fat, so let's say they're at average back fat, that heifer in that restricted group is 5 times more likely to get pregnant. She's more efficient. She put that back fat on, right? Compared to the other one that was in a non-restricted group, it's a little easier for her to get that fat on. Okay, so this is important because now we can see this back fat, that heifer's just more efficient. Another way of looking at this, so let's say we're holding group constant, okay? Regardless of group, the odds of pregnancy was 2 times greater for each 1 millimeter increase of back fat. And this really ties into what Allison talked about earlier about how an animal is going to partition their requirements. So they're going to be putting on back fat pretty late. They're going to be putting on muscle, working towards growth. And we know that once they kind of meet those requirements, them cycling's kind of pretty low on the list. So once she's kind of got a little excess energy she's putting on back fat, she's cycling, it's going to increase her odds of getting pregnant. We also looked at this due to a comparison of open compared to AI bred compared to natural service bred. And we can see here on this graph that x-axis that's going to be the increase of back fat, and on the y-axis is going to be our probability or increasing odds of that heifer getting pregnant. So if we're devoid of back fat, the odds of her being open, which is going to be that gray line, is going to be significantly higher. But as we increase that back fat, we can see that the odds of her getting AI bred increase, and natural service is also going to kind of be in that average area. Now, we do see that natural service, that line kind of tips off a little bit. It's just sort of an artifact of the data that we have, because once they're AI bred, she's not going to get net service, bred by the bull. Okay, so it's a little bit of an artifact and something we will probably investigate in future research. Now, something I didn't really intend on showing with this project, but sort of did, is something we call grass crash. Okay, how many out here, you guys have seen grass crash? May have inadvertently kind of experienced it yourself, right? So this is the case where we have heifers that are dry lotted. Basically, it's a sudden change in their diet because we suddenly kicked them out on grass. Okay, and it makes sense. It's a lot of work to synchronize your heifers, to bring them in. So dry lotting them, it's just easy. They're there. You can bring them in, you can breed them, and then you got all that green grass, you're gonna kick them out on grass. Okay, and it happens quite a bit, but we too tend to see that sudden change can be a problem. We also know that it can have implications on conception because heifers losing weight can be problematic for them getting pregnant. And also, we'd like to see them gaining that weight to increase that conception. So what did we see with this group? So what we did is we took our measurement that we did at breeding, and then we took one final ultrasound measurement when we did a final pregnancy check at weaning at the end of September. Okay, and what we can see is, so the blue line is going to be our non-restricted group. This is our dry lot group. The red is going to be that that group was developed to a lower percentage of body weight. So our restricted group actually gained weight while on grass compared to our non-restricted group that lost weight. We also saw changes in a decrease in ribeye, back fat, and rump fat for both groups of animals. Now what's interesting is we did see an increase in IMF. Now this is a little bit misleading because IMF is measured as a percentage within that ribeye. What happened to their ribeye? The ribeye shrank. So as a result, we did see that increase in IMF, but that's more because that ribeye shrank than them probably actually laying fat down for marbling. Okay. Now, we didn't see any huge drops in pregnancy rates, or we didn't see any early embryonic loss. It was pretty equal in both groups. Can't really say if it was due to this grass crash or just, it's heifers. So, but this was very interesting information in looking at how these heifers transitioned when they went out onto grass. Okay, so where do we go from here, and what did we walk away with this project? So, this is kind of the, no duh slide, right? So if we develop a heifer at a higher average daily gain, she's gonna have a bigger ribeye, she's gonna have more back fat, she's gonna have more IMF. Okay, she has larger pelvic area. We have a higher percentage of those being bred AI, and a higher response to our estrus sync protocol. At the end of the day, though, we didn't see any differences in pregnancy rates between these two groups. What we do see is that back fat is a significant predictor of pregnancy status. Okay, takeaway is that IMF and ribeye were not as significant, which is good if this is what we're trying to do, is adding muscle to our animals if we're trying to increase marbling. Now, there is a caveat to this. We did not overdevelop any heifers. Okay, so I'm not saying go hog wild and start putting on a bunch of back fat on these heifers, right? Because this is not something we explored in this particular project. We didn't overdevelop heifers. And we know through other research is that overdeveloped heifers, that can also hinder their ability to get pregnant. We also see it in bulls. Bulls that are overdeveloped, that can have a negative impact on their fertility. So this is not something that we necessarily tapped into on this project. And when we look at that grass crash scenario, our non-restricted group lost quite a bit of body condition to a greater extent than that non-restricted, or than that restricted group. So what are our takeaway? Question is, who stays in the herd longer? Stay tuned, we don't know. They just now calved this spring. As far as calving goes, we didn't have any calving difficulty. The other difficulties I had was a very angry phone call from a manager saying that they were horrible mothers and he wanted to know if I somehow set up the project for this. I did not, just to be clear, but we're still working on sorting out some of those calves and getting them sorted back out after calving. But we're gonna follow a group of these all the way through. They'll stay in the herd, assuming they bred back this year. We'll see if there's any lingering effects from these, from their development. I will say that they caught up and were at pretty similar ages by the time we brought them in close to calving. They were body condition score for both groups, you couldn't tell the difference. Back fat, could it be a tool for helping us select heifers who have a better chance of getting pregnant? Don't know yet. This isn't, would not say this is something we want to run with. Some future work that needs to be done is at what time point is it more predictive? Can we measure them, 120 days before breeding? And will that give us a good prediction of how she's going to do? The other thing is this could be a good tool if you have a drought scenario and you have suddenly a restriction in feed resources. Is this a tool that you could potentially use to make some hard decisions of which heifers to keep and which ones to cull? Don't know. We still need to do more research in this. The other thing that I do think was very interesting from this project is there is an argument that when we talk about making selection for reproduction, is that we may be potentially masking that ability to select our truly efficient heifers for reproduction because we mask them through providing good management. Okay, and I want to be clear, I'm not telling anybody to go out there and restrict your heifers, right? I really believe that you should be developing your heifers to these target body weights. But sometimes environment steps in and sometimes we have scenarios that are a little restricted, okay? And if these occur, how do we identify these heifers that can really still be adaptive and perform in these environments? Okay, so if you look here on this graph, this blue graph, that's our non-restricted group, and our pink is going to be our restricted. And down here we have this little group of heifers. Those heifers, they looked as good as that non-restricted group. And I have no rhyme or reason or way to really identify how those heifers were able to do it. They were just more efficient heifers. So the question is, long term, how do we identify those? Because those are the heifers we really want, right? They got bred, they put on some back fat, they looked good at breeding, and she managed to do it on a lower quality diet. So these are some things that we are thinking about moving forward and some future research projects that we are working on in the future. So here's my information. If you guys have any thoughts, comments, I'll be around this evening. Please feel free to come by and ask any questions.